A great white shark suddenly leaped out of the water, and the man was overjoyed, hurriedly reeling in his line. Just as the catch was about to be his, he was shocked to discover that the shark he had caught was only half a body. Immediately after, the boat began to shake violently. The next second, meanwhile, far away in Antarctica, the U.S. Navy's USS Reagan aircraft carrier encountered a bizarre incident. They unexpectedly discovered a nuclear-powered submarine that had been missing for 47 hours, but the distance from where it disappeared to this location was more than 5,000 nautical miles, a distance the submarine couldn't have covered in such a short time at its own speed. With rescuing the crew being the priority, the military hurriedly broke open the hatch, but to everyone's astonishment, the food inside was still fresh, and all the living supplies were intact. However, the 177 crew members were nowhere to be found, and all the electronic equipment had short-circuited and burned as if the entire submarine had been struck by lightning. The military suspected it was an attack by a hostile nation, but Professor Serko, who was collaborating on the investigation, did not think so. To uncover the truth, the military deployed a small submarine in the incident area. Laura, as a marine biologist, also joined the investigation. She piloted the submersible slowly descending into the depths. At 1,000 meters, the water was pitch black, with only various strange fish swimming slowly. Laura continued to dive and soon reached 1,500 meters, with the seabed coming into view. Due to volcanic eruptions providing ample organic material, the water temperature here had reached 416 degrees, yet it was still a thriving scene. As Laura was meticulously recording, a shadow suddenly flashed across the screen, accompanied by a bright glow. Laura quickly looked out the porthole but saw nothing unusual. Even the control room's radar didn't pick up any suspicious objects. She thought she was seeing things. Unexpectedly, a piercing screech suddenly sounded, and the surface of the submersible seemed to be struck. Laura anxiously looked to the other side and discovered a giant bioluminescent creature, but eerily, the radar in the control room still showed nothing. Out of curiosity, Laura piloted the submarine to follow it. Not long after, a massive crater over 200 meters in diameter appeared before her. Bottomless and chilling, Laura wanted to take a closer look, but the dashboard showed that the submarine had suddenly started to ascend rapidly. At this moment, the hull began to shake violently, as if something was pushing it. Laura quickly reported to the command room. Then a sharper whistling sound rang out. All the instruments were disrupted, and the command room lost contact with the nuclear submarine. As the shaking grew more intense, Laura clutched her head in pain. The submarine flipped violently through the porthole. Laura was horrified to see one giant creature after another attacking her. She didn't know how much time had passed before the shaking finally started to subside. With her many years of piloting experience, Laura narrowly escaped death. After returning to the research ship, Laura immediately reported the situation to her superiors. There definitely exists some unknown giant creature in the deep sea, larger than a whale, capable of seriously interfering with electronic devices just by its sound, but her superiors did not believe her. The same bizarre occurrences continued to happen around the world. Two fishermen in Spain were fishing in the sea when a large number of meteors appeared in the night sky without warning. The two were about to make a wish, but the meteors became more and more numerous. In the fishermen's terrified gaze, countless meteorites crashed into the sea ahead. Late at night, a group of kids was surfing on the sea in a speedboat. Miles made a mistake and fell into the water. He was about to call for help from his friends when a roar caught his attention. Turning his head, he saw a lizard-like monster clinging to the lighthouse not far away. Before he could react, the monster leaped into the water. Sensing danger, Miles quickly swam towards his surfboard. At this moment, the monster appeared behind him. He turned around in horror, and the monster dived back into the water. Miles was utterly panicked, desperately swimming towards the shore, but unexpectedly, the monster appeared in front of him, letting out a piercing scream. Miles was scared out of his wits. Just when Miles thought he was about to be killed, his mates arrived in time and pulled him onto the speedboat. The next day, Miles described his encounter from the previous night to his classmates, but everyone thought he was just seeking attention. Even his sister Savannah suggested he see a psychiatrist to prove he was telling the truth. Miles took his friend Phil, and they went to the spot where the monster had appeared that night. But after waiting for a long time, they still saw nothing. Just as Phil thought it was all a prank, a strange sound suddenly came. They slowly approached in their small boat, and the sight before them left them stunned. The sea was filled with countless giant eggs, surrounded by disgusting mucus. Driven by curiosity, Miles used a fishing net to scoop one up. They then returned home and put the giant egg in their aquarium. At this moment, Miles was still unaware that this seemingly ordinary giant egg would one day grow into the ruler of the ocean. A few days later, Mom found that all the fish in the aquarium were gone. Miles was puzzled. Could the egg have hatched so quickly? He walked up to investigate, only to find the aquarium completely empty. Just as Miles was about to explain to his mom, the fish tank suddenly shattered, and then the house's lamps and TV began to flicker mysteriously, and something seemed to be crawling up the stairs. Following the trail of mucus, Miles finally found the little monster in the bathroom. While the family wasn't paying attention, Phil quietly moved it to the storeroom. From then on, they had a very unusual pet. Meanwhile, Laura, having finished her underwater investigation, returned to the company only to be told that it had been taken over by the military. The higher-ups were very interested in Laura's findings. Serco, representing the scientists, had an in-depth discussion with Laura. Moreover, Serco knew the characteristics of the monsters very well. Even the fluorescent light and sonic attacks accompanying the monsters were exactly as Laura described them. In the end, the military informed Laura that her involvement in the project was no longer needed. Laura was baffled. She was the one who had discovered this new species, so why was she being excluded? The military offered no explanation and simply asked Laura to sign her resignation papers. That night, the lighthouse near the sea once again echoed with the roars of the monster, and the television experienced severe interference. The elderly lighthouse keeper was still unaware of what was happening. He came to the window but heard a thunderous roar from the sea. Immediately, the window glass began to shatter, and the entire lighthouse exploded. In the darkness, a colossal creature, as large as a mountain, loomed faintly. Two divers, armed with spear guns, were hunting in the deep sea at 150 meters. Soon, a large fish over a meter long appeared before them, and they quickly followed it. But unexpectedly, the fish suddenly seemed to be frightened by something and swiftly swam away. Just as the two were puzzled, a giant fish suddenly appeared in front of them. Accompanied by a deep roar, George quickly aimed his spear gun, but the experienced Rich pulled him away, and they hid in the steel frame of the drilling platform. At this moment, they were horrified to realize that this was no ordinary fish but an unknown monster with limbs and a tail. In his nervousness, George accidentally fired his spear gun, hitting the monster's head with precision. The attacked monster immediately went berserk, and George, unable to react in time, was pulled up by it. Rich quickly took out a small knife, trying to cut the spear gun strap tied to George's hand, but the monster swam further away, and George was dragged along, crashing hard into the steel frame, causing his oxygen tank to leak. Rich hurriedly tried to rescue George, but the monster turned and swam towards the deep sea. Rich could only watch helplessly as his brother disappeared from sight. Though Rich wanted to continue searching, his oxygen was running out, and he had to float to the surface. By the time his companions on the boat realized something was wrong, Rich had already fallen unconscious. When he woke up, Rich found himself in the hospital. Hearing his wife sobbing that his brother's body had not been found, Rich was filled with guilt. If he hadn't taken his brother into the sea, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. Meanwhile, Laura, now unemployed, was on the phone complaining to her father when she suddenly saw a news report on TV about an unidentified creature appearing by the sea. The host introduced the creature as being larger than a whale, not belonging to any known species. This further confirmed her belief that she had discovered an unknown monster in the deep sea. After recovering and returning home, Rich also saw the news. The tragic death of his brother remained a thorn in his heart, and to uncover the truth, Rich ignored his family's pleas and drove to the scene that very night. But to his disappointment, the area was already heavily guarded by the military, and all local residents had been evacuated. Rich repeatedly requested entry but was denied. So, he seized an opportunity to force his way in, only to be quickly tackled to the ground by soldiers. Left with no choice, Rich decided to rent a boat from a local resident and planned to sneak in under the cover of night. Coincidentally, Rich encountered Laura, who was there with her son. They decided to join forces in their investigation. Night fell quickly, and they piloted a small boat to the island where the monster's body was discovered. Unexpectedly, they were still a step too late. The military had already removed the monster, just as they were feeling disappointed. Jesse suddenly noticed many snake-like creatures writhing around them, and he screamed in fright. Laura, well versed in marine life, quickly identified them as hagfish, a species that loves to inhabit whale carcasses. Perhaps the presence of these hagfish was closely related to the monster. So, they captured one hagfish and returned to their place, determined to investigate further. They had never seen such enormous teeth. It didn't belong to any known creature on Earth. Top scientists worldwide were astounded because its owner would need a hydraulic jack just to open its massive jaws. Through measurements, they found the monster's spine to be 2 meters wide, far surpassing the size of the largest dinosaurs on Earth. Its skin was exceptionally tough, resisting even the most advanced lasers which could effortlessly cut through diamonds. The researchers had no choice but to increase the power. After half an hour of continuous exposure, the monster's skin finally showed signs of cracking. Just as everyone was getting excited, the equipment suddenly experienced severe interference. Serco hurried to halt the experiment, but it was too late. The monster's corpse suddenly burst open, spraying a yellow substance. Krishna, who was hit first, lay on the ground unconscious, his face covered in blood. Rushed to the hospital, Krishna's life was saved, but his once handsome face was now wrapped in thick bandages. Serco had just breathed a sigh of relief when Krishna's heart rate began to spike, soon surpassing 140 beats per minute. Yellow fluid from the monster began oozing from Krishna's face, and he started convulsing violently. Doctors rushed to check, only to find Krishna's heart rate had soared to 242. This was far beyond human limits, and Krishna's heart was at risk of bursting. Serco was very worried as Krishna had always been his right-hand man in his research. After another resuscitation, Krishna finally calmed down. However, the doctors tactfully suggested that Krishna might never wake up again. Serco could only accept this result with resignation, but that very night, Krishna, who had been in a coma, suddenly opened his eyes, sat up, and tore off the life support equipment on his hand. A nurse on duty heard the commotion and was stunned when she approached. Krishna had already removed the bandages from his face, and as he slowly turned his head, his face had miraculously healed. Could it be that the monster's fluid had healing properties? Meanwhile, Serco's research had made new progress. They sent a robot deep underground, which, after descending 60 kilometers, reached the Earth's magma layer. Before the robot melted, it sent back a picture showing an unknown creature swimming in the magma. The discovery left them dumbfounded. Could the monsters have been living deep in the center of the Earth? To verify this hypothesis, Serco used a cotton swab to extract some of the monster's fluid and then evenly applied it to his palm. Under Krishna's puzzled gaze, Serco lit a gas lamp and held his hand over the flame. After a few minutes of roasting, Serco's palm remained completely unharmed. Through a series of experiments, Serco was able to confirm that this monster not only had high heat resistance but also possessed strong regenerative abilities. If these findings could be applied to the medical and military fields, it would undoubtedly spark a revolution in new technology, but plans often fail to keep up with changes. Not long after, a bizarre event occurred at a lake in Texas, where tens of thousands of cubic meters of lake water vanished overnight. Staring at the huge hole exposed at the bottom of the lake, Serco felt a sense of foreboding. Miles and Phil went into the bathroom and poured the goldfish from the bag into the bathtub. Don't think they were playing a prank, they were actually feeding their pet. As the two watched curiously, a sound like a baby's cry was heard. Then, a flash of fluorescent light appeared. The little monster happily swallowed the goldfish one by one. At this time, Miles still didn't know how terrifying his pet would become. That afternoon, after school, Miles and Phil continued to feed the little monster. Just as Miles was about to tease the little monster, the once cuddly creature suddenly screamed, and the TV on the wall inexplicably turned on. Looking down, Miles saw that the TV wasn't even plugged in. Could it be that he was raising a 100,000-volt Pikachu? At that moment, Dad suddenly burst in, and Miles thought his secret of keeping a pet had been exposed. Unexpectedly, Dad was just there to get the toolbox. Miles sighed in relief, but then noticed the little monster had climbed onto the door frame. Fortunately, Dad didn't see it. After a false alarm, they are impressed by the cleverness of the little monster. Meanwhile, the girls parasailing on the ocean were not so lucky. They were wildly enjoying the thrill of flying, completely unaware of the approaching danger. After recording a video of herself, one of the girls suddenly noticed the seawater splitting apart in the distance, followed by the sudden appearance of a giant whirlpool. Realizing the danger, she quickly warned her friends on the boat to turn around. Unfortunately, they thought she was just overly excited and paid no attention to the whirlpool that was now within arm's reach. In the midst of her desperate screams, the speedboat was swallowed by the whirlpool. They perished in the belly of the beast. Meanwhile, Laura, who had been laid off, wasn't idle. She had a friend analyze the digestive contents of the hagfish. The results showed that 10% of its genes were from the Tylosaurus. This dinosaur had been extinct for 100 million years. Could it be that the unknown monster was an evolved descendant of dinosaurs? Laura hurriedly called Serco. telling him about her significant discovery. They agreed to meet the next day, but when she arrived at the meeting place, Serco called her onto a helicopter. They arrived above an underwater volcano. Serco told Laura, "This is where you discovered the unknown monster. I brought you here to remind you that there are many things in this world far beyond your imagination. Curiosity can sometimes bring disaster upon yourself." But naive Laura still thought Serco had stolen her discovery. Laura went to her former research institute, hoping her colleagues would help her. But, unsurprisingly, she was rejected. Laura learns from her colleague's evasive tone that he is being threatened by some mysterious forces and that even her own degree is being re-examined. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated, but Laura was not ready to give up. As a single mom, she has to get her job back. Her only evidence was the recording from the ocean floor. Laura put on headphones and carefully listened for clues, but to her disappointment, the disc had clearly been tampered with. Laura couldn't find any valuable information, and no matter how unwilling she was, she had to accept her unemployment. On the other side, Miles was about to have dinner with his family when suddenly, the storage room where he kept the little monster exploded. Miles rushed out, only to see the storage room engulfed in flames, with his pet nowhere to be found. A woman was enjoying the sunshine on the beach when her daughter came over to tell her there was a monster in the water. She didn't pay much attention at first, but then noticed her daughter was holding a squid. She quickly told her to throw it away and asked where she had found it. Looking in the direction her daughter pointed, the woman was instantly stunned. The shoreline was piled high with dead squid, stretching as far as the eye could see. Greedy merchants saw profit in this and began selling the squid as food ingredients everywhere. Laura, who works in a restaurant, thinks there's something fishy going on. As a marine biologist, she keenly sensed that the large number of squid had something to do with whales. She quickly found her friend Jackson and decided to go out to sea to investigate. They drove a speedboat towards the deep sea. A family of sperm whales used to live here, but today the usually active whales were nowhere to be seen. As they were feeling puzzled, Jackson suddenly made a new discovery. The sea surface was littered with dead whales, their bodies covered in massive claw marks. They were utterly shocked. What kind of creature could threaten sperm whales, the apex predators of the ocean? To uncover the truth, Laura ignored Jackson's warnings and planned to approach the whale carcasses for inspection. But at that moment, huge waves suddenly rose ahead, and a glimpse of a giant creature's silhouette flashed beneath the water. Laura told Jackson to take the speedboat and follow it, while she kept a camera on hand for evidence. Shortly after, the boat's sonar indicated they had caught up. As they turned off the engine to wait for the monster to surface, it suddenly turned around and swam towards them. They were horrified, and could only await their fate with trepidation. Before long, a deep roar echoed from the front, and the seawater suddenly emitted a green glow. A powerful electromagnetic pulse swept over, causing all the electronic equipment to explode, rendering the speedboat completely powerless. Fortunately, the monster had already finished feeding, allowing them to escape unscathed. After a night of waiting, Laura decided to take the risk and dive underwater to repair the boat's propeller, but they had underestimated the monster's patience. As Laura was nervously making repairs, she suddenly saw the monster appear not far away. Laura was so scared she almost stopped breathing, but after calming down, she didn't flee in panic. Instead, she had Jackson fetch a harpoon gun equipped with a tracking device. She knew that if she could track the monster's movements, she could definitely get her job back. The massive figure in the water came closer and closer. Laura aimed the gun and fired. After safely returning to the boat, Laura found that the tracking device was indeed working. What astonished them was that the monster swam 130 kilometers in just half an hour. This speed was comparable to a high-speed train. Moreover, the monster seemed to be attracted to something and was continuously approaching the shore. Meanwhile, ever since Rich watched helplessly as his brother was dragged away by the monster, he had been experiencing various hallucinations. Whenever he was near water, he could hear a voice constantly speaking to him. To others, it seemed Rich was having mental problems, and he was soon fired from his job. His wife also left him, taking their daughter with her, but Rich knew deep down that the unknown monster was the root cause of everything. In order to regain what he has lost, Rich is determined to find the monster and put an end to it. In a canal, a huge unidentified creature suddenly appeared, far larger than the biggest blue whale on Earth. The crowd was dumbfounded at the sight. Was Godzilla in the film real? As people debated the origins of this unknown monster, the Coast Guard arrived on the scene. They assured the crowd that they wouldn't harm the sea monster but merely wanted to drive it back to the ocean. They then sounded the ship's horn, and the monster seemed to be very frightened. With 3 boats surrounding it, the monster dives right under the water. The crowd applauded, thanking the Coast Guard for keeping them safe. But Laura and Rich knew all too well that the monster had not left. Suddenly, a deep roar emanated from underwater, followed by an incredibly piercing sound wave. The frequency of the sound grew higher and higher, far louder than the boat's horn. As the crowd felt they were about to break down, a green light spread across the water's surface. Immediately, sparks exploded from nearby wires, short-circuited all electronic equipment, and even the speedboat lost power. Laura and Rich were very excited because they had captured crucial evidence of the monster's existence. Judging by the monster's attack pattern, it must be the same species as the ones they saw underwater. Just as Laura and Rich were discussing this, special agents arrived. Rich tried to negotiate but was quickly taken away by the agents. Laura noticed a familiar figure. It was Serco, who had troubled her several times before. Serco told her that the reason he didn't involve her in this event was to protect her from getting entangled. The military and the government wanted to cover up the truth. Laura didn't believe him at all. Thousands of people had just captured images of the monster. How could the military cover that up? But Serco remained calm and asked Laura to check her camera. It turned out the monster's electromagnetic pulse had destroyed all electronic devices within a 2-kilometer radius. No one could retain any evidence. Laura could only accept this fact reluctantly. However, Serco told Laura that the military had agreed to let her join the research because Laura had single-handedly placed a tracking device on the monster, a task that cost the military millions of dollars without success. Unexpectedly, Laura still got the job she wanted. Meanwhile, since the mysterious disappearance of the little monster Nim, Miles and Phil had been searching the area. That day, they noticed something strange at the supermarket. The lights were flickering rhythmically. In a distant corner, the little monster's shadow flashed by. Miles and Phil hurriedly chased after it, finding the fish and shrimp in the seafood section twitching from electric shocks. In the storage room, they finally saw the pitiful little monster Nim. Seeing Nim's listless state, Miles' eyes filled with tears. But just as Miles was about to take Nim away, the supermarket security guard approached. Nim instantly bolted towards the exit with incredible speed. Serco, the investigator, captured a mysterious sea anemone from the river. When a heat source approached, the anemone actively turned towards it, as if absorbing the heat. But when Serco removed the small sun, the anemone returned to its original state. Repeating this several times, a flash of inspiration struck Serco's mind, as if he had grasped a crucial point. Excitedly, he found his assistant Krishna, and the two examined the anemone's genetic structure together. They discovered it was composed of 3 basic molecular formulas, repeating over and over. If this were a natural product, its genetic sequence could never be so precise. Could it be that these species had been artificially programmed? This major discovery instantly explained the origin of the monsters. No wonder they evolved so perfectly. However, immersed in excitement, Serco was unaware that this discovery would bring him fatal danger. That night, Serco met with Davis, the military representative, and handed over his research results. Davis was also shocked after taking a look and immediately stated that Serco needed to be transferred to Washington for strict protection. Although finding it somewhat peculiar, Serco did not mind. But just as Serco was preparing to head to the airport, a car suddenly sped towards him. After receiving the notice, Laura and Rich also rushed to the hospital, but by then Serco was already critically injured. The local police asked Laura if she knew anything about the incident. Laura noticed mysterious individuals monitoring the hallway. Laura and Rich instantly realized that Serco's car accident was definitely not an accident. Meanwhile, Krishna also sensed the danger, so he organized all of Serco's research materials. But at that moment, unidentified armed men suddenly broke in from outside. Krishna hurriedly grabbed the jar containing the sea anemone, hoping to leave before they noticed. However, it wasn't long before a piercing alarm sounded in the hallway. The armed men had detected his presence and were coming after him with flashlights. Krishna ran desperately, but in his panic, he had an accident. He slammed his waist directly into the sharp edge of a piece of equipment. Enduring the intense pain, he relied on his familiarity with the layout and managed to escape into the elevator at the last moment. Back at home, Laura and Rich were watching the news on TV, but suddenly a loud crash was heard. They quickly ran outside and saw a car had crashed into the barrier in the yard. Rich approached to check on the driver's condition, and to his shock, he discovered it was Krishna. Just as Laura was about to open the car door, the unconscious Krishna grabbed her arm.
You'd have this.
After saying this, Krishna slowly closed his eyes, leaving behind a blood-stained key. Laura and Rich felt an immense heaviness in their hearts. The consecutive misfortunes of Serko and Krishna were likely related to some mysterious military force. If they gave up the investigation now, they would never uncover the truth behind it all. But if they continued to pursue it, the price might be their own lives and those of their loved ones. It was a dilemma. Looking at the key and the address tag in their hands, they both made a decision. A policeman was aiming a taser at a crocodile that had appeared nearby, but in the next second, the policeman was electrocuted, his face scorched. He never realized that it wasn't a crocodile at all, but a pet monster fed by Miles and Phil. Meanwhile, Poland Airport received an emergency distress call from a famous airline's passenger plane, reporting that they had encountered strange clouds and lightning. However, the airport radar showed that there were no clouds in the nearby airspace. Just then, a bolt of green lightning struck, and the plane began to spiral downward. Countless giant monsters were emerging in groups on the ocean surface, with clusters of green lightning flashing around them. The monsters were causing disasters worldwide, but Laura and Rich, conducting a private investigation, were completely clueless about this, until one day, when they placed the sea anemone obtained from Serko into the refrigerator. A bizarre scene unfolded. The entire refrigerator was taken over by green vines, with the anemone pulsating rhythmically like a heart. The vines even extended out of the refrigerator, crawling along the power cord and into the wall socket. It was as if the anemone was consciously recharging itself. Recalling the situation they encountered at the underwater volcano, Laura had a bold hypothesis. Could these unknown creatures be sustaining themselves on electricity or heat? In order to verify this idea, they urgently need to return to the bottom of the sea where they first discovered the monsters, but now they were wanted by the military. So where could they get a submarine? Just as they were at a loss, Laura's friend Jackson came to help them. He dug out an old, abandoned large boiler, suggesting that if they didn't have a submarine, they could build a submersible. Laura carefully inspected it and found the boiler's thickness suitable. It could withstand the pressure at a depth of 2,000 meters. Moreover, a porthole could be cut into the boiler for underwater observation. They got to work immediately, working day and night. Finally, after 4 days, they constructed a makeshift submersible. However, during the first water test, the insufficient sealing of the porthole nearly caused Rich to be seriously injured by the influx of seawater. After continuous improvements, the submersible was finally barely usable, but it would undoubtedly come with great risks. To maximize their chances of survival, Jackson installed an emergency life raft on the submersible. Once the compressor's power was depleted, the life raft would automatically inflate and bring them back to the surface. With everything ready, Rich and Laura entered the submersible one after the other. Jackson maneuvered the tugboat, gradually lowering them into the water. As the cable continued to release, the modified submersible descended towards the ocean floor. At first, the temperature and pressure inside the cabin were normal. However, when they reached a depth of 600 meters, the porthole began to leak again. Jackson was extremely anxious because the time needed to ascend was twice that of descending. If seawater started to flood in, Laura and Rich might be doomed to a watery grave. As they debated whether to return for repairs, Rich suddenly heard a familiar low growl from outside. Meanwhile, to evade the police, Miles decided to release the small monster Nim back into the ocean. Nim seemed to understand and turned, diving headfirst into the water, but Miles was unaware of the devastating disaster this well-intentioned release would cause. A fisherman was about to dive in to repair the floating dock, but he accidentally dropped his hammer into the water. He quickly reached in to grab it, only to hear a strange squeaking sound. Feeling puzzled, suddenly something bit his hand. He yanked it out with all his strength, only to find that his right-hand pinky finger was missing. His companions on the shore heard his screams and rushed over to check, but the fisherman was nowhere to be found. All they saw was a horribly disfigured body floating under the dock. A few days later, a nearby trawler also encountered something strange. Normally, they could catch hundreds of pounds of fish in one net, but this time there were only a few fish. As the net opened, the two crew members were stunned to see a creature that looked like a crocodile sleeping soundly. Could this strange creature be scaring away the fish? The old fisherman locked the monster in a cage, planning to sell it for a good price when they reached shore. But that night, the creature kept making cries that sounded like a baby's wail. The old fisherman, annoyed by the noise, grabbed an iron rod, intending to teach the creature a lesson. He didn't notice that the creature was also glaring at him fiercely. To silence the creature, The old fisherman picked up the box and threw it into the ship's freezer. He didn't realize that the wooden box broke upon impact. The next morning, the captain discovered that thick smoke was billowing out of the freezer. The old fisherman instantly knew he was in big trouble. He called his companions to find the creature and teach it a harsh lesson, but when they got there, they saw that the freezer valve was broken. The temperature inside had soared to over 60 degrees. The little monster darted past, and the old fisherman hurried after it. Although the old fisherman was badly scratched, he eventually subdued the creature. The captain ordered him to throw the monster overboard, but the old fisherman, still furious, kicked the bag several times. Suddenly, a furious roar echoed, and the captain grabbed a wrench for protection, but the monster escaped into the sea. The continuous monster attacks caught the police's attention. They brought in an expert on aquatic creatures, but judging by the wounds alone, the experts were clueless. What kind of creature had the bite force of a crocodile and could also deliver electric shocks? They even killed a 3-meter-long crocodile, thinking they had found the culprit, but an autopsy revealed that the crocodile hadn't eaten in 5 days. Miles knew in his heart that the monster he released likely caused all this, but he didn't say a word. That night, Miles called Phil to join him at the seaside to look for Nim. Soon, they saw waves rippling in the water, and it seemed to be his pet Nim. Miles excitedly ran over, but he quickly noticed something was off. This monster was much smaller than Nim. Just as Miles felt puzzled, a dozen monsters of various sizes emerged around him. Just moments ago, Laura and Rich were piloting their homemade submersible to investigate the mysterious underwater crater, but at a depth of 1,800 meters, the cable suddenly snapped, and the submersible plunged uncontrollably downward. The submersible crashed violently into the mysterious pit on the seabed, and the impact caused the electrical system to fail completely. To make matters worse, seawater began to seep in, and the air circulation system malfunctioned. Laura and Rich were trapped in the pitch-dark depths of the ocean, with only an hour left to live at most. Laura quickly called Jackson on the tugboat, but there was no response. They had tested the system many times before diving, so why did the cable suddenly break? Now was not the time to ponder these questions. Their immediate priority was to find a way to escape. Laura and Rich, summoning all their strength, began to repair the damaged circuits inside the submersible. If they could start the compressor and inflate the emergency life raft, it would bring them back to the surface. But things didn't go as planned. After painstakingly fixing the circuits and pressing the start button, nothing happened. The life raft was pinned under the submersible. Unwilling to give up, Laura pressed the button again, but still, there was no response. She felt a wave of despair. Were they really going to die here? Driven by a strong will to survive, Laura and Rich began to shake the submersible frantically, trying to free the life raft trapped below. However, the terrain they were in was a depression, and Laura quickly realized that this was futile and would only consume more oxygen. Before long, the dizziness of oxygen deprivation set in. Laura glanced at the display screen. The remaining oxygen would only last for 37 minutes. Rich, disheartened, looked up the porthole and saw a figure standing on the seabed. In shock, he hurriedly called Laura over, but when they looked again, there was nothing there. It turned out that this was just a hallucination caused by Rich's oxygen-deprived state. Laura made one last attempt, sending a distress signal to the surrounding waters. It was a desperate measure, but to her surprise, she received a response. Unfortunately, the responder did not understand English. Rich realized that the person was speaking Chinese, but neither of them knew Mandarin. In the end, they had to reluctantly miss this chance for rescue. With oxygen levels plummeting, Laura and Rich lost hope of escaping, but then, the submersible suddenly shook violently, and they immediately realized that this must be the work of the monsters. Laura pulls out a video camera wrapped in special material. She wants to capture some evidence of the monster's existence before she dies. Outside the porthole, in the darkness, a huge unidentified creature seemed to be laying eggs, and on the other side of the submersible, a large number of giant monsters were swimming. Laura and Rich were utterly stunned. Then the shaking resumed, and an idea suddenly struck Laura. If they used the lights to lure the monsters over, could they use their strength to break free? They had no other option but to try. They turned on the external searchlights and began banging on the submersible's hull with a wrench. Before long, a giant sea monster was indeed attracted and swam straight towards the submersible. The massive water flow created a powerful impact, causing the submersible to tumble violently. As the switch was pressed, the life raft successfully deployed, carrying them rapidly towards the surface. After an anxious wait, the life raft finally broke through to the sea surface. Laura and Rich, having narrowly escaped death, couldn't contain their excitement. Laura kicked open the hatch with all her might. At this moment, the weather on the surface was extremely harsh, with waves continuously pouring in through the hatch. Laura and Rich struggled to climb out, using all their strength, but the crisis was not yet over. Jackson, who was supposed to be piloting the tugboat, was nowhere to be seen, and a tear had appeared on the surface of the life raft, with their only piece of tape blown into the water by the fierce wind. Rich, disregarding everything, dove into the sea to retrieve the tape, but in such terrible weather conditions, finding it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. As he searched desperately, he suddenly saw a giant monster on the surface, terrifying him into swimming back to the life raft with all his might. The extreme cold forced them to huddle together for warmth. They barely made it to daylight, only to have the temperature suddenly soar, and the remaining fresh water was insufficient for even one person. To make matters worse, shark fins occasionally appeared around them. Fortunately, as a biologist, Laura knew shark behavior. They managed to scare the sharks away by shouting loudly, but their survival conditions did not improve at all. In the vast, endless ocean without a supply of fresh water, Laura and Rich can only survive for 3 more days at most. Their only hope was that Jackson could track their location and bring rescue. Unfortunately, they were destined to be disappointed. The police soon found the empty tugboat. The deck was stained with blood and scattered with several handgun shells, and Jackson was nowhere to be found. It was highly likely that Jackson had already met with misfortune. Night fell again, and the life raft was severely leaking. They could only cling to each other to combat the loss of body heat. In the distant sea, streaks of green lightning tore through the night sky. This also signaled that more monsters were gathering in the area. Laura and Rich fell into complete despair, left with no choice but to quietly await death's arrival. The rain kept pouring down harder, forcing them to keep their heads up to avoid drowning. Just then, the monsters suddenly attacked, hurling them into the air and slamming them into the water. When Laura and Rich struggled back to the life raft, they found that their life-saving equipment was now completely destroyed. With no other choice, Laura and Rich could only drift in the sea, relying on the last bit of buoyancy. Soon, they drifted into a strange area of the ocean, surrounded by bizarre giant eggs. Laura finally understood the monster's intent. It was only trying to protect its offspring. If they hid among these giant eggs, the monster would surely stop attacking. With no other options, Laura and Rich stayed quietly among the giant eggs. Sure enough, the monster did not attack again. Laura accidentally crushed one of the giant eggs and green liquid flowed out. Rich instantly realized that this glowing liquid could be used as a distress signal. They quickly crushed several eggs and then waited quietly for rescue. After an unknown amount of time, the sound of a helicopter suddenly roared above the sea. Rich quickly fired their last flare, and the pilot, seeing it, flew towards them immediately. But just as the rescue was about to commence, the sea monster suddenly leapt up, nearly swallowing the helicopter. Watching the helicopter gradually move away, their newly kindled hope turned to despair again. Just as they were about to give up, the helicopter returned, and this time, it swiftly rescued them. Laura and Rich, barely surviving, were fitted with breathing apparatuses. When the rescue personnel tried to take their bags, they anxiously stopped them, because inside were the things they risked their lives to obtain. That was the video footage of the underwater monsters. Next, it was time to expose the military's crimes to the public. Miles had come down with a strange illness that required him to be placed in a tub filled with ice to lower his temperature. In his semi-conscious state, Miles kept calling out the name of his pet. Not long ago, in his search for his missing pet monster, Nim, Miles was attacked by a group of smaller monsters on the coast. Miles hobbled home, but the wound on his leg wouldn't stop bleeding. After a simple disinfection, Miles didn't think much of it. He was pleasantly surprised to find that Nim had somehow returned home on its own. After being away for a few days, Nim had grown a lot, but lost in his joy, Miles didn't realize that his neglect could almost cost him his life. The next day during class, Miles suddenly felt his head grow heavy. When the teacher called on him, he stood up only to find his vision blurring and blood seeping from his leg. Miles wanted to continue answering the question, but his body involuntarily collapsed. Savannah, who attended the same school, rushed to the nurse's office upon receiving the notice. After taking his temperature, it was discovered that Miles had a fever of 41 degrees Celsius. At Savannah's strong insistence, Miles showed the doctor the wound on his leg. By this time, the wound had become severely infected. Just as the doctor was about to proceed with further treatment, Miles slipped back into unconsciousness. Miles was then urgently rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. To the doctor's astonishment, Miles's temperature had soared to 45 degrees Celsius. This was beyond the limit a human body could endure, so they had to place Miles in an ice tub to bring down his temperature. Despite the gravity of his condition, Miles continued to call out his pet's name. After Miles was admitted to the intensive care unit, the doctor approached with a grave expression. In her career, she had never encountered such bizarre symptoms. Miles's leg wound was not infected, and his other physiological indicators were normal, with only a slight imbalance in electrolytes. What, then, was causing the fever? Savannah suddenly thought of the pet monster at home. To assist with the doctor's treatment, she decided to bring Nim to the hospital for examination, but capturing that little creature wasn't easy, as Nim was only close to Miles. Fortunately, Phil was familiar with Nim's habits. He sprinkled Nim's favorite sea salt in the room. Sure enough, Nim obediently crawled into the pet cage. Savannah rushed back to the hospital and quickly went to find the attending doctor, but in the blink of an eye, the cage had already been bitten through, and Nim was nowhere to be seen. They searched frantically, only to find Nim perched on Miles's hospital bed, licking his leg wound. Seeing everyone approaching, Nim turned and fled. The doctor was shocked because Miles's EKG had flatlined, and she hurriedly used a defibrillator to resuscitate him, but despite her efforts, there was no response. Meanwhile, the aquarium curator and the police cornered Nim in the hallway. Seeing the terrifying creature, the police officer didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. With the sound of a gunshot, Miles bizarrely woke up. He struggled to his feet, searching everywhere for Nim. Unfortunately, the tragedy had already occurred. Nim lay in a pool of blood. Miles collapsed in a corner, holding Nim's lifeless body tightly in his arms. He firmly believed that Nim had never harmed him, but it seemed that fate was sealed, and no one could understand the pain in his heart. Miles's vital signs quickly stabilized, and even the scar on his leg mysteriously vanished. Only then did Savannah realize that it was Nim who had cured her brother's strange illness. Miles could hardly believe that his pet monster had become a cold corpse. As he gently stroked Nim, he suddenly noticed that Nim seemed to sneeze, and in the next second, Nim astonishingly opened its eyes. Miles was overjoyed, wondering if Nim had the power to come back to life. At that moment, Nim suddenly leaped up and quickly hid under a nearby table. Clearly, the harm inflicted by humans had filled Nim with fear. Miles quickly grabbed a sea fish to try and calm Nim down, but the little monster merely dragged the fish under the table. Seeing this miraculous scene, the aquarium curator immediately suggested conducting research on this new species. Nim's powerful self-healing abilities could greatly benefit human society. To alleviate Miles's concerns, the curator promised not to harm Nim. Naively, Miles was eventually persuaded. He took out Nim's favorite sea salt and successfully lured it out. Although Nim was filled with unease in the human world, it always trusted its master. Nim obediently nestled next to Miles. This scene left the curator and others astonished. 2 days later, Miles returned to the aquarium, only to be stunned by what he saw. A large number of instruments had been placed beside the water tank, and Nim lay listlessly at the bottom, uninterested even in the delicacies around it. Through inquiries, Miles learned that the curator and his team had not fed Nim in order to study its hunting behavior. Miles felt extremely distressed, but at that moment, the curator seemed like a different person, impatiently demanding that Miles not disturb their work. Just then, Nim suddenly sneezed. Miles immediately realized that this was a sign of Nim's unease, but the curator believed that Miles' presence would distract Nim, so he rudely asked him to leave. Feeling more and more uneasy, Miles returned to the lab, only to find that the curator and his team had injected Nim with a sedative. It turned out that in order to study Nim's self-healing abilities, the curator intended to extract spinal cells from Nim. Miles wanted to stop him but was directly thrown out. The curator sternly warned him that if he interfered with the experiment again, they would call the police. Helpless, Miles could only go home sullenly, but the streetlights flickered inexplicably as he walked by. Miles found it strange. Could it be that his body had also gained some special abilities? When he got home, he discovered that his eyes had eerily turned into vertical pupils. The bathroom lights also seemed to be affected. Even his breathing began to emit the same low growl as Nim. The changes in his body made Miles very uneasy. Could he be turning into a humanoid monster? To ease his fears, Miles invited his girlfriend Caitlyn to the beach for a walk. As emotions ran high, they slowly moved closer, but sparks bizarrely flashed from Miles's lips, and Caitlyn thought it was just static electricity. However, when she reached out to touch Miles, A stronger current suddenly surged through. The two young people ran into the sea to swim, but half an hour passed, and they still hadn't returned to shore. Their friends' loud calls for help caught everyone's attention, and people prepared to go into the water to search. But just as Caitlyn was about to rush in, Miles stopped her. Miles had seen that green lightning was flashing continuously on the surface of the sea. This indicated that something terrifying must be lurking nearby. The next day, more people arrived at the accident site to search. They scoured the area for several kilometers but found nothing. At that moment, some teenagers discovered a severed arm in the bushes. The watch on the arm identified it as belonging to one of their missing classmates. Hearing the tragic news, the parents broke down instantly, while Miles stood frozen, knowing that the culprit had to be those unknown monsters. Seeing the grieving parents, Miles for the first time questioned if he was right to protect Nim. The police soon arrived at the aquarium to investigate. Although there was no evidence linking the case to Nim, no one could guarantee it wasn't done by one of its kind. The curator was concerned about his research, but the frequent monster attacks on humans had become an undeniable social issue. Angry parents held a hearing, loudly condemning the monster's atrocities. One parent even smashed a giant egg to declare his enmity against the monsters. Under immense public pressure, the police decided to implant a tracker in Nim. After releasing Nim, they hoped to locate more of its kind and wipe them out. Since Miles was Nim's real owner, the police decided he should be the one to implant the tracker. Despite his heartbreak, Miles complied. With a confused look in Nim's eyes, Miles implanted the tracker. Soon, the tracker showed that Nim had reached an unfamiliar sea area. The police quickly deployed and found a large number of monster eggs floating on the water. Just as they were about to clear them, Miles suddenly noticed a disgusting mucus secreting from his hand. This discovery made him uneasy again. Was he really turning into one of the monsters? To eliminate the fear, Miles secretly poured gasoline over the giant eggs in the water. While no one was watching, he set the entire surface on fire. Back at the aquarium, the curator determined from the tracker that Nim was not dead but had appeared in a swamp near a residential area. The police immediately rushed to the scene, using trawl boats to drive the monsters towards the shore. Dozens of fully armed militiamen stood ready. Each person was excited but also tinged with fear because they had no idea how terrifying their opponents might be. As the little monsters approached, a battle between humans and beasts was imminent. With the captain's order, gunfire erupted, and one monster after another was hit, letting out baby-like wails. A monster that managed to climb ashore was quickly knocked down. A man lifted the corpse of a monster, ready to boast about his kill to his companions. But the monster revived and bit him on the neck. The situation quickly deteriorated. As more and more monsters kept attacking, the monsters, with their strong self-healing abilities, launched a fearless assault on the humans. As casualties increased, the human defense lines completely collapsed, forcing them to retreat. Even when they took refuge in their cars, the monsters continued to attack. The windshield soon had a gaping hole, and a man grabbed an iron rod to make a last stand, but a monster bit his arm. At that critical moment, a familiar voice called out. It was Miles who had arrived. The monster in front of him was none other than his pet, Nim. Miles sincerely apologized to Nim and then removed the tracking device from its body. At the same time, Caitlyn was horrified to see more and more monsters gathering around Miles, as if awaiting his command. This scene left the other militiamen dumbfounded. Miles comforted Caitlyn and then led the swarm of monsters toward the sea. At this moment, Miles had become the undisputed leader in the eyes of the monsters, but the conflict between humans and monsters had become increasingly sharp. Would their war really end here? The next day, Miles woke up on the beach and returned to the street to call his family and assure them of his safety. But just then, two dogs on the roadside started barking furiously at Miles. His eyes eerily turned into vertical pupils again, and the dogs seemed extremely fearful. It was then that Miles realized his body was becoming more and more like the monsters. Not only that, his taste preferences had changed. As he kept adding salt to his food, Caitlyn noticed all of this and her worry grew stronger. Suddenly, Miles felt a strange connection in his mind, and looking down, he saw Nim had followed him. Nim jumped onto a seat, nearly scaring the waiter to death. Seeing the monster in his restaurant, the owner pulled out a shotgun, ready for a deadly showdown. Fortunately, Miles stopped him in time. The restaurant owner also felt unsure, so he slowly lowered his hunting rifle. Miles and Caitlyn then left the restaurant with Nim. They went to the beach, and the crowd around them turned pale at the sight of Nim. Following Miles's instructions, Nim obediently jumped into the sea, wanting its owner to live in the deep sea with it. But Miles knew he and Nim were not truly the same kind, so he could only watch with a heavy heart as they swam farther and farther away. Back at school, the way the classmates looked at Miles was especially strange, and someone even put a few salted fish in his locker. Miles clearly felt isolated. Miles didn't want to cause trouble, but after school, a male classmate came up to provoke him. The boy pushed Miles down and then started kicking him while cursing at him. Miles did not fight back, but the boy then locked his arm tightly around Miles's neck. Just as Miles was about to suffocate, a huge surge of power welled up inside him. Miles grabbed the boy's hand and forced him to his knees, then placed his right hand on the boy's forehead. A flash of electricity passed through, and the boy immediately lost consciousness. The classmates looked on in disbelief at what had just happened. Miles himself was equally terrified. Could it be that he really had become the monster they saw him as? In the abandoned factory, an eerie sound of a little girl crying could be heard. Out of curiosity, Rich slowly approached, hearing a faint noise coming from under the table. Could it be a lost child? Just as Rich was about to pull the child out, a giant ape-like monster suddenly sprang up and launched a fierce attack on him. Not far away, Laura heard the cries for help and quickly drew her handgun and rushed over. At this moment, the ape monster was still attacking, leaving Rich completely powerless to fight back. Seeing the monster about to drag Rich away, Laura, terrified, raised her gun and fired, but none of the shots hit the ape monster. The ape monster left a handprint on the window in anger before slowly escaping to the back. Why did they experience such a terrifying ordeal? A few days earlier, they had released evidence of the monster they had painstakingly captured through the media, but the military already knew everything and had bribed several experts to claim on television that Laura's video footage was fake. The general public had no ability to discern the truth, so no one believed in the existence of giant sea monsters. Moreover, the experts also accused Laura of academic fraud. This move instantly turned the situation around, making Laura and Rich targets of public scorn. As they were struggling to prove themselves, they suddenly received a mysterious email. The sender claimed to know the origin of the monsters and arranged to meet them outside the city. Laura and Rich, skeptical but desperate, drove to the meeting place. Upon arrival, they found the sender piloting a private plane. After confirming their identities, the mysterious person insisted that Laura come with her. Although Rich was very uneasy, he knew that without uncovering the truth, they would never clear their names. Shortly after, Laura was blindfolded and taken to a secret laboratory. Here, Dr. Morris finally confessed everything to her. 20 years ago, Dr. Morris was employed by a mysterious organization determined to develop a drug that could enable the human body to self-repair. Due to her outstanding research in genetics, Dr. Morris was given an important task. She used artificial programming to fuse the unique characteristics of dozens of organisms, eventually succeeding in giving a type of nematode the ability to self-heal. But Dr. Morris later learned that the organization had hired over 2,500 scientists like her, each responsible for a very small field. It wasn't until she saw the sea monster in Laura's footage on TV that Dr. Morris realized the monster's appearance must be related to her research. So, she decided to tell Laura the truth. However, Dr. Morris knew very little about the organization's true nature. She only knew that it had once owned a very famous pharmaceutical company. Laura wanted to ask more, but a wave of dizziness hit her, and she quickly collapsed, losing consciousness. When Laura woke up again, she found herself lying by the side of a road. Back at her place, Laura and Rich immediately began searching for information on the pharmaceutical company. They found that some of the drugs produced by the company were indeed very suspicious. Laura and Rich disguised themselves as reporters to investigate the company, but their trick was quickly uncovered. Left with no choice, they secretly infiltrated one of the company's secret warehouses, but it was already deserted. Laura and Rich split up to look for any remaining clues. Unexpectedly, they encountered the talking ape monster. The fog surrounding the mystery seemed to be lifting layer by layer. Meanwhile, after displaying his superpowers at school, Miles quickly caused unease among the people around him. In their eyes, Miles had become a complete monster. For the sake of community safety, a dozen parents stormed into Miles's home, and despite his family's protests, they grabbed Miles and were about to forcefully take him to the police station. At that moment, the sheriff suddenly fired a shot into the sky, then announced a shocking piece of news to everyone. 2 kilometers underwater, a group of giant monsters was digging, as the heat from the volcanic vents was no longer sufficient for their needs to survive. They were moving towards the Earth's magma layer. However, The actions of thousands of monsters had completely altered the seafloor's geological structure, triggering a massive 9.4 magnitude earthquake. Monitoring agencies on the U.S. East Coast quickly detected strange sounds from the seabed. Researchers hurriedly analyzed the sound waves, but the conclusions they reached left them stunned. Such a high-intensity earthquake would inevitably trigger a mega tsunami, with 100-meter-high waves likely to sweep across half of the United States. Upon receiving the warning, the sheriff immediately informed everyone of the shocking news. At this point, people no longer cared about punishing Miles. They rushed home to pack and prepare to flee. Miles's family also fell into a panic, with his parents hastily gathering food and water. Miles took out a gasoline can to refuel the car. At that moment, they saw on the TV that the highways were completely jammed, and the tsunami was expected to hit in 2 hours, making escape by car an impossibility. With no other choice, they rushed to the nearest dock to board a ferry. They barely managed to get on, but Miles realized that Caitlyn wasn't on the boat. Miles learned from Caitlyn's father that she had gone to his house earlier, and they had missed each other on the way. In his anxiety, Miles suddenly saw a young man riding Caitlyn's electric bike. Miles confronted him and, without a word, beat him up. After learning that the person had stolen Caitlyn's electric bike near his home, Miles became even more anxious. Ignoring his parents' pleas, he jumped into the sea and swam desperately for half an hour until he finally reached his house. But Caitlyn wasn't there. The TV still showed the city's traffic gridlock. At that moment, a familiar roar echoed. It was Nim. Guided by Nim, Miles finally found the unconscious Caitlyn on a side road. They returned home to look for his father's car keys, but Nim was engrossed in watching TV. The screen showed a reporter on the front lines who was suddenly swallowed whole by a giant monster. Only then did Miles and Caitlyn realize that other creatures like Nim were lurking within the tsunami. Panicked, Miles and Caitlyn quickly drove away. At an intersection, they ran into Laura and Rich. The main characters of the story finally met, almost getting into a car accident. Once in the car, Laura witnessed an incredible scene. These kids had adopted a monster baby as a pet. Rich was so scared he almost jumped out of the car. He couldn't believe that after months of searching, there had been a group of little monsters living in the city all along. Shortly after, the car ran out of fuel, and even more terrifying, the 100-meter-high tsunami was approaching. In the critical moment, the four of them hurried toward the nearest tallest church. In their panic, they climbed the stairs to the roof, but the skylight wouldn't open. Meanwhile, the overwhelming sea water rushed toward the church and surged through the shattered windows. Just as everyone was about to give up hope, the violent shaking suddenly stopped. Miles thought the tsunami had ended, but Laura told him it was just the beginning. The tsunami waves would only get stronger. Hearing this, Rich quickly grabbed a brick and started desperately smashing the iron lock on the skylight. At that moment, a terrifying roar suddenly echoed. Miles looked out the window in shock, only to see a giant monster swimming in. They were so frightened they didn't dare to breathe. Fortunately, the monster only came up to sniff them before turning away and leaving. As the second wave of the tsunami hit, Rich finally broke open the skylight, and the four of them hurried to the roof. Huddling in a corner, trembling, in the face of such a terrifying natural disaster, they could only leave their fate to chance. They didn't know how much time had passed before everything finally calmed down. Miles looked up and saw Nim casually standing on the wall. He realized that Nim must have been the one to make the giant monster spare them. They slowly got up and looked around with unbelievable eyes, only to see that the formerly prosperous city had become an ocean of. All the truths they had yet to uncover were now hidden beneath the deep water. Thus, the first season of the American series Surface concludes.